The first time I stood in front of Blackwood Resort, rain soaked through my coat and ash clung to the soles of my boots. The building rose out of the storm like a burned skeleton, windows sealed with rusted metal, the roof slumped inward as if it had finally surrendered to gravity. The air smelled wrong, sharp and old, like smoke that never truly left. In that moment, I understood something I had avoided my entire life. My mother had not given me this place by accident. 3 hours earlier, she had sat at the head of a polished conference table and smiled as she slid the folder toward me. She called it my share, not a punishment, not a liability, a gift. Her voice softened in that practiced way, the same tone she used with reporters and donors, as if she were being generous, even kind. As if handing your youngest daughter a condemned resort buried under lawsuits, environmental penalties, and a decade of unanswered questions was an act of love. What she did not know was that I recognized Blackwood the moment I saw it. This place was not a ruin to me. It was a crime scene she believed had been erased, and I was standing exactly where the truth was buried. The inheritance meeting had taken place that afternoon in the Mercer Group's executive boardroom, a room designed to intimidate without raising its voice. Frosted glass walls, steel accents, a view of the city that reminded you who owned it. My mother, Victoria Mercer, sat at the head of the table, perfectly still, hands folded, expression unreadable. She had built her empire on control, not warmth, and today was no different. My sister Clara sat to her right, composed and luminous in a tailored suit, the future already written into her posture. When my mother announced that Clara would assume operational control of Mercer Tower, along with a significant stake in voting shares, the room responded exactly as expected. Applause, nods of approval. A few murmured congratulations. Clara accepted it all with a calm smile, the kind that suggested she had never doubted the outcome. Then my mother turned to me. She did not preface it. She did not explain. She simply slid a thick, dust-stained file across the table and said my name. Inside were photographs of Blackwood Resort, taken from a distance, charred and hollow, surrounded by trees that had grown wild in its absence. Pages of legal attachments followed. Fire damage reports, environmental notices, civil claims that had been quietly settled and reopened more than once. "This property will be transferred to you immediately," my mother said. "It's time you took responsibility for something of your own." Responsibility. The word landed heavily in the room. I could feel the board members relax, even before they tried to hide it. Blackwood had been a problem for years, a stain on otherwise clean books. By handing it to me, my mother wasn't dividing assets. She was relocating risk. I looked up at her then, searching her face for something I had stopped expecting long ago. An explanation. A flicker of doubt. Anything. She met my gaze briefly, then looked away, already finished with the moment. Clara glanced at me just once. Her smile didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened, as if she were watching a door close behind me. No cruelty, no sympathy, just satisfaction. I signed the papers without asking a single question. The pen felt heavier than it should have. When I finished, I slid the folder back across the table and said thank you. The word tasted strange in my mouth, but I said it clearly. I watched my mother's shoulders loosen, just slightly. She believed in that moment that she had won, that I would either fail quietly or disappear under the weight she had handed me. What none of them understood was that Blackwood had never scared me. I had spent years restoring damaged structures, learning how to read what fire left behind, how heat warped truth as much as it warped steel. I knew the difference between an accident and a message. And Blackwood had always felt like a message. When I left the building, the city felt distant, unreal. I didn't go home. I drove straight out of town, the sky darkening ahead of me, rain starting just as the road narrowed. By the time Blackwood came into view, night had settled in fully, and the storm was relentless. I stepped out of the car and stood there, letting the rain soak me through, staring at what my mother had called my share. She thought she had handed me a dead end. But as I stood in front of the blackened walls, listening to the wind move through broken spaces, I knew the truth. This inheritance was not a burden. It was evidence. I stayed in the car for a long minute, engine ticking as it cooled, headlights cutting weak tunnels through the rain. Blackwood loomed ahead, larger up close, its burned frame swallowing light instead of reflecting it. This was not a renovation visit. I had not brought tools, paint samples, or hope. I was here to read a body, not revive it. The main doors were chained, but the side entrance hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, layered with the smell of old smoke and something sour underneath it. Fire does not erase, it rearranges. I could see where the heat had raced along the ceiling, where it had paused, where it had been fed. The pattern was wrong. Too contained, too intentional. I moved slowly, testing each step. The floor groaned but held. Furniture outlines were still visible in the ash, ghosts of chairs and tables burned down to suggestion. I crouched near a wall where the plaster had bubbled and cracked, exposing brick that should have blackened more deeply if the fire had spread naturally. It had not. It had been guided. My phone vibrated in my pocket. An automated notice from the county landed in my inbox, time-stamped less than an hour earlier. Demolition authorization confirmed. Site clearance scheduled within 48 hours. I closed my eyes and let that settle. The timing was precise. The transfer had gone through that afternoon. The clock started the moment my name replaced hers on the paperwork. Once Blackwood was flattened, the remaining liabilities would have nowhere to attach except me. Environmental fines, civil exposure. Any unanswered criminal questions would die with the debris. My mother had not handed me a problem. She had handed me a countdown. I scrolled further. Additional notices followed, layered like a trap. Reopened environmental assessments. A dormant civil claim flagged for review. A quiet reference to a fire investigation that had been closed years ago for lack of evidence. Every loose end she had buried under silence was suddenly my responsibility. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. So this was the play. Transfer the wreck, trigger demolition, let the youngest daughter absorb the fallout, clean books in time for the next phase of the company's expansion. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and turned toward the service corridor that led underground. The basement was not listed in the public inspection reports. It rarely is. Fires move upward. What they leave behind below is easier to ignore. The stairwell was partially collapsed, but passable. My flashlight cut across warped concrete and rusted pipes. The air grew colder the farther I descended, damp enough to beat on my skin. At the bottom, the floor was layered with debris that had clearly been shifted before. Someone had been down here after the fire. Not to salvage, to hide. I knelt and brushed ash aside with my gloved hand. Beneath it, the tiles were scorched but intact, their pattern interrupted by hairline cracks that did not belong. I pried one loose, then another. The sound echoed too loudly in the enclosed space. That was when I heard footsteps, not the building settling, not water dripping, footsteps, deliberate, measured. Someone was moving above me, closer than I liked. I killed the light and pressed myself into the shadow of a support column. A beam of illumination swept across the basement, thin and searching. The silhouette that followed it was bulky, purposeful. A man dressed for work, not rescue. He carried fuel, not tools. My pulse climbed, but my mind stayed clear. He moved like someone finishing a job, not starting one. This was not inspection. This was erasure. I waited until he passed the stairwell, and then moved. keeping low, slipping through a side corridor that branched into the old service tunnels. The walls narrowed, the ceiling dipping where heat had weakened the structure. I knew where to step, where not to. I let the building guide me the way it always had. The man cursed when a section of floor gave way beneath him, crashing into a shallow water reservoir below. I did not stay to watch him recover. A sharp command cut through the darkness. Freeze. I stopped, hands lifting slowly. The man who stepped into view was older, lean, holding a rifle with practiced ease. His face was lined, his eyes steady, not panicked or cruel. He did not look at me like a target. He looked at me like a problem he had been expecting. "Put the light down," he said quietly. "You're safe. For now." I did as he asked. "My name is Elias," he said. "I worked for your father." The words landed harder than any threat. He led me deeper into the basement, to a section reinforced with steel plating that had survived the fire almost untouched. Together, we cleared the remaining tiles. Beneath them sat a metal box, sealed and heavy. "That fire wasn't an accident," Elias said as we lifted it free, "and this place never belonged to your mother." I opened the box with shaking hands. Inside were journals, architectural records, and a sealed digital drive wrapped carefully against moisture. In the distance, the low rumble of engines drifted through the walls. Demolition crews were arriving early. I looked at Elias, then back at Blackwood, and finally at the evidence resting in my hands. The inheritance had changed. It was no longer a trap. It was leverage. Dawn crept in slowly, gray and cold, revealing the outlines of heavy machinery parked just beyond the tree line. Yellow paint, steel arms folded like insects at rest. They were closer than they should have been, too organized, too ready. My mother hadn't waited for 48 hours. She never did when she sensed hesitation. Elias stood beside me at the edge of the clearing, his jaw set. "They moved the schedule," he said. "That means they expect you to panic." I didn't answer. Panic was exactly what they wanted. A frantic phone call, a desperate plea, a signature I didn't understand. I watched the men near the machines sip coffee and smoke cigarettes, pretending this was just another job. They didn't know what was buried beneath their boots. Or maybe they did, and that was why they looked uneasy. I thought about the transfer agreement, the language my mother had insisted on adding. Responsibility clauses, environmental compliance, full assumption of liability. At the time, it had read like overkill. Standing there now, I saw it clearly. She hadn't been protecting the company. She had been preparing a weapon, and she had handed it to the wrong person. The first engine roared to life just as another car pulled up behind the machines. Clara stepped out, sunglasses on despite the weak light, heels sinking slightly into the damp ground. She surveyed Blackwood with open disdain, as if the place offended her simply by existing. "This ends today," she said loudly. "Not to me, but to the crew. We're clearing it." I stepped forward, placing myself between the lead machine and the structure. "You can't," I said. Clara laughed, short and sharp. "Move," she replied. "You've had your moment." The operator hesitated, glancing between us. I could see the calculation in his eyes. Liability versus paycheck. Orders versus instinct. I raised my phone and pressed record. "My name is Isla Mercer," I said, my voice steady as I turned the camera toward the resort. "This property is under my legal responsibility as of yesterday. What you are about to do will release hazardous materials into the air, including substances already documented in previous fire damage assessments." Clara's smile faltered. "Turn that off," she snapped. I didn't. I explained the clauses clearly, slowly, the way my mother had taught me to speak to investors. I named the consequences: environmental violations, criminal exposure, corporate accountability that could not be outsourced once the dust settled. The words felt sharp and precise, honed by years of listening and learning in rooms where I was never meant to speak. The live feed counter climbed. The crew supervisor lifted a hand. The engines fell silent one by one. Clara stormed toward me, her composure cracking. "You're bluffing," she hissed. "You don't know what you're talking about." I held the phone higher. "Everything I'm saying is documented," I replied, "and everything you're doing is being recorded." She reached for me then, fingers brushing my arm, pushing, trying to shove the phone away. Her voice rose, ugly and sharp, spilling words she would never have used indoors. It all went out live, every second of it. "Clara," someone called from the crew, nervous now. "We can't—" She turned on them like a flame. "Do your job." But they didn't move. The supervisor shook his head. "I'm not risking prison," he said flatly. "Not for this." The machines powered down. The men stepped back. Clara stood there, breathing hard, her reflection fractured in the dark glass of Blackwood's windows. She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger, like she had just realized I was no longer where she left me. "You think this changes anything?" she said. It wasn't a question. "It changes everything," I replied. I ended the broadcast and slipped my phone into my pocket. The quiet that followed was heavier than the noise had been. Elias let out a breath I hadn't noticed he'd been holding. "This will reach her," he said. "I know." Clara left without another word, her car tearing down the access road, mud spraying behind it. The crew followed soon after, engines retreating into the distance, leaving Blackwood standing in the pale morning light. Victory, if it could be called that, felt thin. Elias looked at me, concern etched deep into his face. "She won't let this go," he said. "You didn't just stop her. You embarrassed her." I looked back at the resort, at the walls that had survived fire twice now. "Good," I said quietly. As the silence settled, I understood what I had done. I had dragged the family war into daylight. I had made myself visible in a way my mother despised. There would be no more quiet threats. Whatever came next would be louder. Blackwood stayed quiet for the rest of that day, but the silence felt artificial, like the pause before something breaks. News clips from the live stream replayed on my phone in fragments. Headlines hedged their language. Questions replaced conclusions. I could feel my mother's attention turning, narrowing the way it always did when control slipped through her fingers. Elias warned me not to stay alone. I ignored him and slept in my car, parked where I could see the service road. Sometime after midnight, headlights cut through the trees and stopped just short of the clearing. The vehicle idled for a long moment before the engine shut off. A man stepped out who did not belong to the woods. He wore a tailored coat despite the damp, shoes too clean for the ground, posture relaxed in a way that suggested he was rarely denied access to anything. He did not call out. He waited, hands visible, as if the meeting were already agreed upon. "My name is Julian Black," he said when I approached. "I imagine you've heard of me." I had. My mother spoke his name the way people spoke about storms, something dangerous but distant, a force you prepared for rather than confronted. Julian Black had circled the Mercer Group for decades, never close enough to be sued, never far enough to be ignored. He smiled slightly, reading my silence. "I'm not here to threaten you," he said. "I'm here because you just rattled the cage." He opened a slim briefcase and laid a stack of documents across the hood of his car. Old paper, yellowed edges, contracts stamped and restamped, the kind that survived because no one wanted to admit they still mattered. "Blackwood," he said, tapping the top page, "is not just a burned resort. It was collateral. Original collateral. The foundation of a loan that built your mother's empire." My breath caught despite myself. He explained it calmly, almost kindly. A joint venture decades ago. A clause buried so deep it had been forgotten on purpose. If the debt tied to Blackwood was never formally discharged, ownership of the land carried more than liability. It carried leverage, voting power. Influence my mother had assumed no longer existed. She forgot, Julian said, or she believed no one left alive knew. I thought of my father, of Elias, of the box hidden beneath the basement tiles. You want me to sue her, I said. I want you to survive her, he replied. If that means litigation, I have the resources. If it means something uglier, I won't pretend otherwise. I felt the weight of the choice settle in my chest. Aligning with Julian Black meant stepping fully into a world my mother had trained me to observe but never enter. It meant trading one kind of danger for another. I don't trust you, I said. He nodded. Good. Trust is a liability. Elias watched from a distance, his face unreadable. When Julian left, the clearing felt emptier than before. This man is no savior, Elias said. I know. He'll use you. So will she, I replied. The difference is she already has. That night, I went through the contents of the metal box again, architectural plans annotated in my father's hand, notes about materials that didn't match the official records, and the digital drive, still sealed, still unknown. Evidence layered on evidence, all of it pointing toward a truth my mother had buried beneath paperwork and fire. By morning, my decision was made. I met Julian in a neutral office overlooking the city, glass walls and quiet power humming through the air. His legal team moved efficiently, explaining terms without ceremony. He would back my claim. I would retain ownership of Blackwood. The dormant clause would be activated publicly, not whispered about in back rooms. You understand, Julian said as we stood to leave, that once this moves, it cannot be contained. I've lived contained my entire life, I replied. I'm done. The handshake was brief, no smiles, no congratulations. Just an agreement forged from mutual advantage. As I left the building, my phone buzzed with a single message from my mother. We need to talk. I looked out at the city she believed she owned and felt something inside me settle. Blackwood was no longer just a site or a secret. It was a trigger. And I had just pulled it. I disappeared on purpose. After the live stream, after Julian's visit, after my mother's single clip message, I stopped responding. I didn't issue statements. I didn't correct the rumors. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. I knew my mother better than anyone. When she couldn't control the story, she rewrote it in public. 3 days later, the announcement came. The Mercer Foundation would host an emergency charity gala. Unity, transparency, moving forward together. The venue was carefully chosen, a glass pavilion overlooking the valley just below Blackwood, close enough to imply ownership, far enough to feel safe. Every major outlet was invited, investors, board members, politicians who owed favors. It was optics, not generosity. That night my phone rang. My mother didn't waste time. You will attend, she said. You will apologize. You will make it clear this was a misunderstanding. And if I don't? A pause. Just long enough to be deliberate. Then I can't guarantee the safety of certain people who have inserted themselves where they don't belong. She didn't say Elias's name. She didn't need to. I agreed to come. The pavilion glowed against the darkening sky, all white light and soft music, champagne flowing like absolution. My mother stood at the center of it all, regal and calm, greeting donors as if nothing had fractured beneath her feet. Clara was beside her, flawless again, hair perfect, expression serene. They looked like the picture everyone wanted to believe in. When I entered, the room shifted. Conversations paused, then resumed at a lower volume. Eyes followed me as I crossed the floor. My mother turned, surprise flickering for just a second before she recovered. There you are, she said warmly, taking my arm. I'm so glad you came. She guided me toward the stage before I could respond. The speech began the way all of hers did, with gratitude and vision and carefully measured humility. She spoke of family, of legacy, of responsibility. Then she gestured for me to join her, framing it as reconciliation. I stood beside her under the lights, heat pressing down, the audience waiting. "My daughter has been under a great deal of stress," my mother said, voice soft. "She misunderstood some matters and acted emotionally." I nodded, lowering my gaze. The room leaned in. "I want to apologize," I said into the microphone, letting my voice waver just enough. "For allowing confusion to spread." Relief rippled outward. Then I lifted my head. "I should have spoken sooner," I continued. "Because the truth is, Blackwood was never confusion. It was collateral." The silence was immediate and total. I explained it simply. The dormant clause, the unresolved debt, the authority that came with ownership my mother had never legally extinguished. I stated calmly that as of that moment, I held voting power sufficient to block key Mercer Group actions until the matter was resolved. Faces drained of color. Phones came up recording. Clara turned toward me sharply. "That's not possible," she said too loudly. Julian's legal team stepped forward from the side of the room, documents already in hand. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. My mother reached for the microphone, her composure cracking for the first time. "This is inappropriate," she snapped. "This discussion does not belong here." "It belongs everywhere," I replied, "because you made it public." Security hesitated, unsure whose orders to follow. The gala dissolved into chaos, donors backing away, investors whispering urgently into phones. My mother stood frozen, caught between fury and calculation. The event was shut down within minutes. Reporters surged forward. Questions flew. No one had answers that could undo what had been said. As the crowd thinned, my mother turned to me, her voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you've started." I met her gaze, steady. "I know exactly what I started." I walked out of the pavilion alone, the night air cool against my skin. Behind me, the Mercer image collapsed in real time, glass walls reflecting a truth that could no longer be hidden. I didn't feel victorious. I felt exposed, and I knew with absolute certainty that my mother would not forgive this. The fallout hit before sunrise. By the time I woke, my phone was vibrating nonstop with alerts I couldn't open, trading halts, emergency board sessions, analysts arguing in clipped voices on financial news panels. My mother had vanished from public view, but her fingerprints were everywhere. When optics failed, she always preferred pressure. My accounts were the first to freeze. A polite email arrived from a compliance department I had never heard of, citing routine review. Another followed from a law firm representing an anonymous party, demanding I cease all public statements related to Blackwood. The language was sterile, but the message was clear. I was being boxed in. Julian called before noon. "She's testing your stamina," he said. "If you fold quietly, she'll rebuild around you." "I'm not folding," I replied. "I know," he said. "That's why this will escalate." It did that night. I wasn't at Blackwood. Julian had insisted I stay elsewhere, a temporary apartment with reinforced locks and a view of nothing memorable. Sometime after midnight, a sharp smell cut through my sleep. Gas, too strong to be accidental. I moved without thinking, hands shaking as I forced open a window and dragged myself onto the narrow ledge outside. The explosion never came. Instead, there was silence. Then sirens in the distance. By the time authorities arrived, the line had been tampered with just enough to deny intent. An accident, they said. Unfortunate timing. Elias didn't pretend otherwise. "This is how she cleans," he said quietly. "She makes it look survivable." I didn't sleep after that. By morning, Julian had relocated me again. His security team swept the space, methodical and efficient. On a long table, we spread out the contents of the metal box and the digital files I had been avoiding. There was no more time for restraint. The deeper we looked, the clearer it became. Blackwood was only the beginning. The architectural record showed shell projects that never existed, their costs inflated and redirected. The digital drive held transaction logs routed through entities I recognized from Mercer Group filings, all tied back to Clara's division. "She's been moving money," Julian said, scrolling. "Large amounts, repeatedly." I stared at the screen. My mother knew. "She structured it that way," he replied. "If it collapsed, it would collapse on Clara." The realization settled like ice in my chest. My sister had been handed power with one hand and a fuse with the other. Golden on the surface, disposable underneath. An emergency shareholder meeting was announced that afternoon. My mother appeared again, composed and controlled, addressing concerns with the confidence of someone who believed she could still outmaneuver the truth. Clara stood beside her, pale but smiling, unaware that the ground beneath her was already gone. Julian nodded once. "It's time." We released the evidence in stages. Regulatory filings first, then targeted disclosures to oversight bodies that could not ignore them. By the time the meeting convened, the room was thick with tension. When the questions came, they were sharp and specific. Clara faltered. Denials turned brittle. Numbers didn't align. Documents contradicted her words. I watched from a private feed as her composure cracked, the confidence she wore like armor finally failing her. My mother stepped in, voice cool, decisive. She expressed shock, outrage, a willingness to cooperate fully. She distanced herself with surgical precision, framing Clara's actions as a personal betrayal of the company's values. I felt something inside me go very still. Clara turned toward her, disbelief written across her face. "You knew," she said. Not loudly. Not for the room. Just enough to be heard. My mother didn't answer. Security escorted Clara out as cameras flashed, her image collapsing in real time from heir to liability. The Mercer narrative fractured completely, pieces scattering in every direction. I didn't intervene. There was no satisfaction in watching it happen, only clarity. This was who my mother had always been. Loyalty was conditional. Love was strategic. That evening, Julian called again. "She's wounded," he said, "but she's still dangerous." I looked at the city through the window, lights flickering like distant signals. "What's left for her to do?" There was a pause. "When power is cornered," Julian said, "it burns everything around it." I thought of Blackwood, of fire that erased and fire that revealed, and I understood then that my mother's final move would not be legal. It would be destructive. The warning signs arrived quietly, the way real danger always does. Insurance activity around Blackwood spiked overnight. Inspection requests were filed and withdrawn within hours. Fire safety permits that normally took weeks were suddenly expedited. Julian called just after dawn, his voice tight. "She's preparing to erase the asset," he said. "Not legally, physically." Elias didn't need convincing. "This is scorched earth," he said. "If she can't control it, she'll burn it." I drove back to Blackwood before anyone could stop me. The road felt narrower than before, trees closing in, shadows stretching across the asphalt like fingers. When I arrived, the place looked unchanged, still scarred, but standing, stubborn in its refusal to disappear. I walked the perimeter, noting fresh tire tracks near the service gate. Unmarked vehicles had been here, watching, waiting. I didn't leave. Instead, we prepared. Julian's team installed discreet surveillance equipment, hidden in places only someone who knew the building's bones would think to check. Elias coordinated with local authorities under the guise of routine safety monitoring. Everything was positioned not to prevent damage, but to record intent. Proof mattered more than preservation now. That night, the forest went unnaturally quiet. Just after midnight, headlights appeared at the edge of the clearing. A large transport vehicle rolled forward, its markings partially obscured, the smell reaching me before the engine cut. Chemicals, accelerants. My chest tightened, but my mind stayed sharp. This was it, the final play. I moved quickly, slipping out through a side exit as the vehicle breached the gate. The driver didn't hesitate. He knew where he was going. Flames erupted moments later, fast and violent, licking up the already wounded structure with terrifying efficiency. Heat pressed against my back as I ran, lungs burning, heart hammering. Behind me, Blackwood roared, fire reclaiming what it had been denied for years. I didn't look back until I reached the tree line. Sirens followed almost immediately. Police lights cut through the smoke, red and blue strobing against the orange glow. Fire crews poured in, containment swift and aggressive. The response was too fast for coincidence. Julian had been right. Everything had been timed. I stood shaking in the darkness as officers secured the area. An investigator approached, calm, focused, already aware that this was not an accident. He asked me to stay where I was. Across the clearing, I saw her. My mother stood near the edge of the road, watching the fire with an expression I recognized instantly. Satisfaction edged with calculation. She believed even now that destruction equaled control, that without Blackwood, I would have nothing left to stand on. Then the investigator received a call. He listened. His posture shifted. My mother's phone rang at the same time. She answered, irritation flickering across her face, then confusion. Then something colder. She lowered the phone slowly, eyes searching the scene as if looking for a way out that no longer existed. Recorded instructions, financial trails, witnesses she hadn't accounted for. The operation traced back to her with a precision she could not deny. When the officers approached her, she didn't resist. She straightened, lifting her chin, every inch the woman who had ruled rooms for decades. As they took her arm, her gaze found mine across the chaos. For a moment, neither of us moved. There was no apology in her eyes, no regret, only a sharp, furious disbelief that I had survived long enough to see this through. Then she was gone, escorted past flashing lights and cameras, her empire finally collapsing under the weight of its own methods. The fire was contained before dawn. Blackwood stood again, damaged but not destroyed, smoke curling upward like a signal rather than a grave marker. I watched the last flames die out, exhaustion settling deep into my bones. This time, the fire had not erased the truth. It had illuminated it. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky pale and indifferent, I understood that the war was over. Not because I had won, but because there was nothing left to burn. What remained was judgment, and that would take time. 6 months later, the silence felt different. It wasn't the tense, waiting silence that had followed me my entire life, the kind that meant something bad was coming if I breathed too loudly. This silence was earned. It lived in the wide spaces between sounds, in the way the air moved through Blackwood now without resistance. The trial had stripped my mother of everything she once wielded like armor. No cameras, no boardrooms, no carefully managed image. When I sat across from her in the visiting room, the glass between us felt unnecessary. She was smaller than I remembered, her posture rigid, her hands clenched as if holding on to something invisible. She started the way I knew she would. "I built everything," she said. "You exist because of me." I listened without interrupting. I didn't come for closure. I came to end the conversation. "You created me," I said evenly, "but you also taught me exactly how power works. I just learned the lesson better than you expected." Her eyes hardened. She leaned forward, voice sharp with desperation. "You think this makes you better than me?" I shook my head. "No, it makes me free." That was all there was to say. I stood before she could respond and walked out without looking back. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was abandoning something. I felt like I was leaving it where it belonged. The Mercer Group dissolved quietly. Assets sold, divisions absorbed. The name lingered in headlines for a while, then faded into case studies and cautionary footnotes. Clara's case moved forward without my involvement. I didn't testify for or against her. What happened between her and our mother had been decided long before I ever touched Blackwood. Julian exited my life the way he entered it, efficiently and without sentiment. Elias stayed long enough to see the truth acknowledged, then disappeared into a life that finally belonged to him. We never talked about what came next. We didn't need to. Blackwood changed slowly. The fire damage was stabilized, not erased. Charred beams remained where they could, reinforced with steel and glass. Light poured through restored windows, catching on textures that told the story instead of hiding it. The place reopened as a cultural and architectural center, part restoration, part memorial. People came to see what survived, not what was destroyed. On opening day, I stood off to the side, watching strangers walk through spaces that once felt like a grave. I didn't give a speech. I didn't need to. The building spoke well enough on its own. What surprised me most wasn't the peace. It was the clarity. I had spent my life being told what I was worth by people who needed me to believe it was less. I had confused obedience with love, silence with strength. Blackwood taught me something different. That survival isn't quiet. It's deliberate. And justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like standing exactly where you were meant to fall and deciding not to. That night, I walked the grounds alone, the sky clear above me. The air smelled clean, honest. I thought about how close I had come to being erased, how easily the story could have ended another way. It didn't, because I stopped waiting for permission. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been handed a burden disguised as a gift, or told to be grateful while someone else took the credit, I want to hear from you. Which moment hit you the hardest? The inheritance, the gala, or the fire that finally ended it all? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're drawn to stories where justice arrives quietly but decisively, where power shifts without shouting, make sure you're subscribed. There are more stories like this coming, and I'd love to have you here for the next one. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's choosing what you build after the fire. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact.